Only in India do we see a mix of green and pink, India being a major producer and the largest consumer, of course. So when we look across the world in terms of production,
Jim.
Yes, Ernest.
Just to cut in a bit, we are not seeing your screen. You may want to share your screen, please.
You're not seeing it. Oh.
Yes.
Let's have another go.
How
about that now?
Bingo, we have it. Thank you very much, and please continue.
Okay. So we're talking about the overview of the cashew world in 2021 and what that means for 2022. And on the screen now, eventually, you can see, I hope, a map of the world. The green countries are the producers, the darker the color, the greater the producer, and the pinkish red colors are the consumers. As I was saying, only India have you got that mix of a major producer and a major consumer of cashew nuts. So when we look at the map, we see the blue boxes are regions where production increased in 2021. And generally across the world, there was an increase, although in India, we saw a dip in consumption and in production. Of course, the fact that more than 60% of the world's production is in Africa and most of the world's processing is in Vietnam and India means we have the raw cashew nut trade, which last year reached record levels. And the trade is generally, in terms of its volume, a pattern from West Africa to Vietnam or to India, from Cambodia into Vietnam, and from East Africa into India and also into Vietnam. If we add to that the kernels trade, again, we notice that with the exception of India, the vast bulk of cashew kernels are not only consumed far from where they're grown, but are also consumed far from where they are processed, giving rise to the west to east trade in raw cashew nuts and the east to west trade in cashew nut kernels. And that's because production is concentrated in Africa, India, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia, and consumption is concentrated in North America, Europe, and India. And these are the big factors that influence the pattern of trade and the way the market moves. So when we see the red box in India, it means that last year Indian consumption was under a certain amount of pressure, at least in terms of its share of world consumption. On the other hand, we see Europe, North America, China, and East Asia, all with very positive trends in consumption. So last year we saw, generally speaking, better crops than the year before, better consumption than the year before, with the one question mark being the Indian market and how it progressed and managed through the pandemic. So within that context, we should look and see what are the factors that we need to look at this time of year that influence where the market and where the major trends may go for the rest of the year. So I would always say, let's look in Vietnam and look at the Vietnam crop first. Now, the Vietnam crop is less than 10% of the world crop, probably around about 8%. But its influence on Vietnamese processors, who are the huge buyers of raw cashew nuts, is profound. And it can have a huge influence on their way of thinking. If we look back to 2017, a poor crop in Vietnam, followed by absolute panic in the raw cashew nut market, gave rise to a spiral of prices, which finished beyond anything that any of us imagined at the time. So looking at the reaction in Vietnam to the crop situation is really important. Now that's probably changed a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years as Cambodia's production has developed. Cambodia is about 12% of the world crop now. It's a neighbor of Vietnam. Most of the Cambodian cashews grow within a day or a couple of days maximum drive from Vietnamese processing factories. So this changes the dynamic a little bit. We should also look at the RCN stock position in Vietnam. That's not normally something that we would be overly concerned about or we'd be overly looking at. But in the last 3 years, it's been a fact that the opening stock of RCN at each season has been increasing for various reasons. And some would say that's strategic, some would say it's speculation. Whatever it is, it's a fact. Fourth factor we should look at, and we will look at, are the current prices relative to history. Are prices low? Are they high? Do cashews look attractive for buyers? Or are they unattractive? And that's a major factor in buying decisions. India, of course, we've got to look at in the same way we look at Vietnam, perhaps. But in India, we must look at demand. The biggest market in the world, changes in demand trends in India would have a major impact on the overall supply and demand situation. And what we try to do with India is we look at the stock, we look at the crop, we look at the likely trends in demand, and we try to calculate Indian needs for raw cashew nuts. So as we've seen last year, India imported almost 870,000 tons, quite a big number in the context of the last 10 years. Not quite the largest number, but we might be looking at India's imports breaking that record in the coming year. Then we look at West Africa, we're going to look at the crops, we're going to look at the weather, and whether or not there is early buying in the RCN market. Fortunately, in the last 3 years, we can also add to that a much improved situation on processing, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, and a much improved demand for cashew kernels from African countries, especially West African countries. And finally, we look at consumption. None of this happens unless somebody eats the cashews somewhere. And we're looking at two things. How much cover do buyers in Europe and North America have? In other words, how much of their annual supplies have they already bought? And the key factor there is whether they've bought it from importers or whether they bought it directly from processors. In other words, who in this chain is running a short position at the moment? And more generally, we look at the likely trends of demand. So these are the factors that we should look at this time of year. And one of the key things about cashews is anyone who's been looking at this market will know we need to look out for the propaganda efforts to influence the market. Our business is less transparent than many products. We don't have a futures exchange. We don't have the tools that make it more accessible. And therefore, it's easier, on the one hand, to try to influence the market. And on the other hand, the quality of information often means that we just don't get the right story at the right time, for whatever reason. So it's essential that we bear that in mind when we're looking at these early season indicators. So those are the things we should look at. Let's have a quick look at the state of the market. I've still put it with the background of the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. That still is with us, despite the fact that it's a waning factor for many of us, fortunately, but it still is a factor in how it has affected the supply chain. And let's look at the situation last year. So in India, let's start with Vietnam, actually. In Vietnam, we saw record exports last year, some 577,000 tons of kernels, remarkable figure. And we saw officially recorded very high imports. But I think there's recognition that the Vietnam import figures last year had some errors in them, and that those figures, which caused much controversy from April onwards last year, mostly around about the Cambodian figures, I think those figures are being reviewed at the moment, and we may well see some explanation. But I doubt we'll ever have the full story of what happened in 2021 on imports into Vietnam. As I mentioned, Cambodia. So Cambodian production is still increasing. Cambodia is the fastest growing producer, and that is likely to continue to increase. And we'll have a look at the rise of Cambodia shortly. India last year, an average crop steady demand is the best I think we can say. Indian demand certainly suffered through the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully it will recover. There are signs that it will recover. There were signs last year that it will recover. And certainly the damage to demand was very much linked to the pandemic. So as those restrictions are lifted, as the picture changes, we would expect Indian demand to return to earlier growth rates. West Africa last year, we had good crops, generally speaking. We had slow shipments, which had a profound impact on the stock position in Vietnam and the buying patterns in those countries. We saw increases in processing, although they were mostly in Cote d'Ivoire. Elsewhere, the picture for processing was not as positive. And we saw, encouragingly, higher prices for 320s from West African countries than from Asian competitors throughout 2021, probably starting or really noticeable from April onwards, where that market reflected, first of all, the freight, but also a number of other factors, which we'll also look at shortly. East Africa, 2021, a bit of a disappointing crop in Tanzania, but big changes in the regulation, big changes that mean that investment in processing is easier, more likely to happen. And I know that there are a number of projects in the pipeline at the moment. So I think we will see increased processing again in Tanzania. Mozambique, there have been changes in the regulation. If you recall, we spoke about those in one of our last sessions of 2021, but it's been a tough time for processors, and there has been a reduction in processing volumes in Mozambique, not least because of the exit of Olam from processing in that country. Demand-wise, China continued rising demand, strong imports from Vietnam in 2021. Similarly, in Europe, a good increase again last year, consolidating strong increases in the previous 2 years. Those big consumer trends are still there, trends around convenience, trends around healthy eating, trends around conscience-driven consumption. And we saw notably an increase in the share of African cashews consumed in Europe. That is African cashews processed in Africa. And that's risen now, heading for 11% in 2021. In the US, similarly, very strong demand. We saw a 9.5% increase in imports, which is really remarkable for a market like the US, which only a few years ago people thought was mature and wouldn't see any particular growth. 89% share for Vietnamese processors. And maybe that says a lot about the US market. Maybe it says something about the price sensitivity of the US market. Maybe it tells us about the structure of the market, the position of private label packing in the US market. African share in the US is 4.6% based on imports last year. That's better than 2020, but still not as good as 2019, which is a bit disappointing, but something that might change again in 2022. That's the state of the market. You would have to say that generally the cashew sector came through the 2 years of the pandemic. I'm assuming that the pandemic is now, for the most part, past. Indications are that. We never know, of course, if the past 2 years have taught us anything, is that literally anything can happen. So let's focus in now on production and more current factors, and we'll start looking in the 3 big Asian growers, at least the 3 big Asian growers for the Northern Hemisphere crop. From Vietnam, the news is that the crop is certainly lower than expected. Range of estimates are wide. We see an estimate of 370,000 tons from Vinacas, based on a very high yield per hectare, which I must say I'm surprised at. We see very low estimates from some of the traders and some of the locals in the market. So it's difficult to know, of course, but the range of estimates is so wide. The lowest I've heard is 250,000 tons, and the highest is 370,000 tons. It's probably somewhere in between, of course. Does this mean a huge fundamental shortage in the market? No, of course not. Vietnam is only about 8% of world production. So there's no need to react to a lower crop in Vietnam. Definitely there is a higher than expected inventory in Vietnam. There might be some concerns about some of that inventory. We'll come back to that in a little while. Certainly the inventory is needed. It's maybe a maximum of 2 months processing stock. There were lower imports in January than in the previous January. And there are always forward sales. Processors must have forward sales. That's what their customers need. So at this time of year, when we look at the market, we can assume that generally processors and our importers are still in a position where they have a lot of buying to do. If we look in India, demand is expected to return as the pandemic restrictions disappear. We would expect demand, and there is some suggestion that there would be pent-up demand related to family events and a general reopening of society in a way that we haven't seen over the past 2 years. Crop forecasts range from 750 to 775,000 tons, which would be a good crop by Indian standards. I think the record is 825,000 tons, so that would be a good crop. It may be late. Late crops are always vulnerable, so we need to keep an eye on that. The inventories of RCN are relatively tight, and I would expect that imports into India this year would at very least match the 866,000 tons of last year, and in all likelihood, they will exceed imports of 2021. Looking at Cambodia, we have to put Cambodia in the context of very, very strong growth. Now, we know that the weather was not ideal in Cambodia. We know that this may well have impacted quality, and if it impacted quality, you can be sure it's also impacted quantity. The crop could be larger, even though the weather has been poor, because you've got more and more trees coming online. And if we look at the growth in Cambodian production, we see very sharp growth. And this year, the estimates that we're hearing range from 450,000 tons to 500,000 tons. So everything we talk about in Cambodia has to be related to the context of a lot of new trees coming online. Now let's just have a look at how that came about, and I'm going to call this the rise of Cambodia. First of all, Cambodia was a relatively small producer until 2017, 2018, and then it started to rise. So driven by attractive prices, the availability of high-yielding varieties, particularly a variety called M23, which gives a very high yield, production has been increasing. Cambodia has a large area suitable for growing cashews, and it has farmers which are relatively efficient compared to farmers elsewhere. Plus, as you can see, Cambodia is located right beside the largest buyer of raw cashew nuts in the world. So you can imagine farmers in 2016, 2017, high prices, planting cashew trees. They know that the market is very close by. They know that they're going to produce a high quality raw cashew nut, and they know that it can make them a good return. At that time, other options were not really open. So options such as growing fruit were limited because markets in China were still closed to Vietnamese producers. So trade was going via Thailand, trade was going via Vietnam into China, and that limited prices. Now that's changed, and the Chinese market for other tree crops has opened. And we'll have to see what that does to the trend in the increase in the production of cashew nuts in Vietnam. But we still have to say, for the time being, there are at least 3 years left where Cambodian production will grow as more and more trees come online. There will have been an impact of low prices from the end of 2018 onwards, particularly 2019, where planting may have slowed down. So I would expect production to reach a level sometime around about 2025. And from that, then it will return to relatively slow growth. That could be impacted by other markets. It could be impacted by fresh fruit markets. It could be impacted by other crops in Cambodia. And we need to keep a close eye on that. But from an African point of view, it's also interesting to note how quickly Cambodian production has increased. It's interesting to note that the high yield varieties have been instrumental in that. And it's also interesting to note how the reaction of farmers and the efficiency of farmers in Cambodia has caused production to move up so quickly. So what does this mean for the market? Well, in simple terms, it means about 400,000 tons more raw cashew nuts since 2019. It's meant that there is more inventory closer to Vietnam during harvest time. This gives more time for Vietnamese processors to start by buying activities in West Africa. They have more time to have a look because they have that buffer of Cambodian production during February, March, and April. So I think the first thing it means is that the scenario of 2017, where we had almost panic amongst buyers from Vietnam on the back of a poor crop there, is unlikely to happen again. Not unless we get poor crops in both countries. So looking at today's situation, we have a disappointing crop in Vietnam, that seems fairly likely, and a disappointing crop in Cambodia, but probably not to the extent where it would stimulate panic buying, not to any extent close to that. Now, to put this in context, I just did a calendar of cashew production. So you can see monthly cashew production, and you can see the total figure. So over the year, as we know, most of the production in the Northern Hemisphere is February, March, April, and May. This is West Africa, India, Vietnam, Cambodia. We know that that leads to the availability of raw cashew nuts, something like this, these red bars. This is the availability for import during the period. So as the crops rise, the availability for import increases. Now, what the Cambodian crop, or the advent of the Cambodian crop, has done is, number one, it's increased the available material. About 400,000 tons more available than was available going back to 2015. But it's also put that product in an earlier period. So it has a very different impact to, let's say, production increases in West Africa, where even if the West African crop increases and is harvested in March, you still have to assemble it, ship it, bring it to destination. The Vietnamese crop is in February, March, April, and the Cambodian crop is in roughly the same position. So that's not only increased the volume, but put it in a position where it's more accessible for Vietnamese processors. And for the time being, processing in Cambodia is very limited. There are ambitions to increase processing and value addition in Cambodia, but right now, almost all of the product finds its way to Vietnam for processing. And it's a high quality product generally, although this year may be a little bit different. So Cambodia has had a big impact on the market in the sense that it has increased the volume available, but it's increased it in a period that takes a lot of pressure off buyers in Vietnam in terms of their reaction in West Africa. So they now have an additional, around about additional 400,000 tons available, and it's within 2 or 3 days, compared to increases in West Africa, where huge additional tonnage, but you can't do anything about the 60, 90, 120 days it takes to get the product to market. And of course, it's not impacted in the same way by the disruption to freight and logistics as West African supplies have been in the last 2 years. So let's move on and have a look at West Africa and what we're hearing this year. So here we are with the map. The ships represent the ports. The black lines represent a typical regional cross-border trade. The red lines represent typical but illegal regional cross-border trade. For example, the export of raw cashew nuts from Guinea-Bissau cross-border into Senegal for export. We're certainly hearing, to start in the east, we're certainly hearing that the crop in Nigeria is lower. We understand it's about 15% lower from expectations. That would bring the crop below 200,000 tons. That's due to the weather conditions that have been experienced. And as a secondary factor, we're also hearing that the difficult logistics and troubles with imports, particularly in Lagos, are going to slow down exports. So there is a disruption to supply from Nigeria this year. If we look in Benin, we see a very positive official estimate of 200,000 tons of production. I'm a little bit puzzled by that, so I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit and say that I think it's may well be influenced by imports cross-border from Nigeria and elsewhere, and that actual production is probably closer to 130,000 tons. I'm open to discussion on that one, of course, but it seems to me that this year, if there are fewer imports from Nigeria, then it's likely that there will be lower exports from Benin. And that would have an impact, and it would particularly have an impact on Indian buyers who are very much interested in Benin raw cashew nuts. It's one of the most popular origins in India, always bought up very quickly, and we could see that happen again this year. If you look in Ghana, I'm hearing reports from around Ghana that the crop is perhaps not as good as expected, that at least early crop supplies are tight. The market is well above the minimum price, and we've seen a minimum price set in Ghana this year for the first time. And that is an interesting and possibly welcome development, but the market is well above that price at this time. Now, that may be partially influenced by better regulation and enforcement on the Côte d'Ivoire-Ghana border, where material is not flowing across as it once was, according to reports that we're hearing. And that will have an impact in Ghana, and it will have an impact, of course, in Côte d'Ivoire. We also hear some reports that the crop in Eastern Côte d'Ivoire is not as good as expected, which might also influence availability across the border in Ghana, where Indian traders wait for supply. If we look in the biggest cashew producer in the world, Côte d'Ivoire, the official estimate at the recent World Cashew Conference was about the same as last year, just over 1 million tons, which makes the country by far the world's largest producer of cashew nuts. Next in line would be India, 775,000 tons. Obviously, the lead is very high for Côte d'Ivoire. I was in the country last week, and we got feedback that the first crop is a little bit below expectations, that it's disappointing that some rain is needed. There hasn't been undue demand so far, so prices have moved up away from the minimum prices at the warehouses and at the port, but prices still seem to be stable at the farm gate. Again, I would have to say that the reports are mixed. On the one hand, we hear in some areas good supply, product rolling in, no real problems, and one processor told me that they saw their quality as better than last year. In other areas, we see a much tighter position. rain is needed. If the rain comes, there's no reason to think that there will be any major crop problem. And there's no reason indeed to think the rain won't come. It normally does. So I'd remain cautiously optimistic on Cote d'Ivoire. Burkina Faso and Mali, again, in these two countries, estimates are very difficult. The accuracy of the estimates is always questionable because there is a big difference between the actual official crop figures and the cross-checked trade figures when you see what arrives at destinations. There is probably a chance that the weather will have an impact, as it has done in Nigeria and Ghana, but so far we don't have any confirmation or indications of that. So for the time being, the forecasts for the crop remain positive. In the very far west of the region, the three major producing countries still have positive forecasts, but of course those crops are some way away and it is a little bit too early to make any estimates. So looking across the region, what we see is a relatively mixed set of forecasts. Certainly on the eastern half, Ghana, Nigeria, some questions. In the western part, far fewer questions and more optimism on the size of the crop. I am questioning the crop. I am saying that there are some concerns. I'm not saying that there is any reason to think that there's any way a bad crop, a poor crop, or anyway a crop disaster. And I wouldn't like anyone to get that idea. So we put together an initial estimate. And as we always do it, we do a high estimate and we do a low estimate based on different sources. And it looks to us that on the optimistic side, the crop will slightly exceed last year's crop. And if we take the worst case, it would be lower than last year, but still a better crop than 2020. So no real cause for concern. I think probably of more concern, and we should look at, is the overall trend. That's the light green line over the top of the bars. And what we see is that in West Africa, which has been the driver of increased cashew production worldwide for more than 10 years, we are seeing a slowing of that growth. And we've got to ask the question as to whether or not in the current situation, we can expect growth that will match consumption growth in the coming years. Let's focus in on the world's largest producer of cashew nuts. Cote d'Ivoire production, compared to all of its neighbors in West Africa, has been in a very positive, strong trend for a very long time. And we've seen production perhaps level out in the last 3 years, but that's only as it's reached very high levels. Now, there might be a couple of concerns here. We might be starting to think about aging trees. We might be starting to think about reduced yields as a result. So far, production has generally increased in the very broadest sense based on extension, that is, more trees planted in more areas. There has been some improvements in quality, that's for certain, but in general terms, average yield, average outturn per hectare hasn't increased in any major way. So this would lead to concerns that as the trees get older, and we're now looking, back in 2008, we were looking at 300,000 tons production, which means that some of these trees are now well over 20 years old. There will be some concerns that in the coming years, there will need to be a replenishment, a replanting, and rehabilitation of some of the trees. And walking around cashew growing areas last week, it was very noticeable again, still, the trees are very close together. The harvesting practices are not ideal. There is a huge potential for increased production just by getting those things right. Pinning trees, looking after them better, and better harvest methods. We look at production, and this has been production has been the headline for so many years, and now processing is becoming a focus in the country. And as we can see, and I've based this on The capacity is based on figures from CCA. The actual RCN processed is based on figures from CCA again. The figures are closely followed because subsidies have to be paid. But the exports of kernels is actually based on a cross-check on international markets and where product was eventually delivered. So we can see that production, actual RCN, the orange bars, this is really what we need to look at. And we can see that there has been a tremendous increase, particularly since 2020, when 2019 wasn't a great year, and 2020, it started to come back. Last year, they talk about something like 135,000 tons processed, with expectations that will reach perhaps as much as 180,000 tons in 2022. Looks like a very rosy picture, doesn't it? But there would be some concerns, particularly when we look at where do these cashew kernels go in 2021. And this puts a slightly different picture on processing in the country. And the big factor is that of the 32,000 tons of kernels exported, 62% went mainly to Vietnam as Burma kernels. So only 13% of exports went to the US, 23% to the EU, and some smaller percentages to other markets. But it means that effectively, the growth in processing in the country has been largely part processing. In other words, it's not leaving the full value of the cashew kernels processed in the country. It's a kind of an interim procedure. And as someone very nicely said, I thought, or put it very well at the World Cashew Conference, this type of business leaves most of the value addition in Asia and most of the problem shells and byproducts in Cote d'Ivoire. And that's something that needs to be addressed. So in summary then, what we're seeing is production growth flattening, but probably in 2022, more raw cashew nuts in the country as the cross-border trade is curtailed. We're seeing processing highly dependent on the so-called Burma kernels. If you were with us last year, you'll know my opinion on that trade. It's not very positive. We see throughout the country processors struggling with management. Some have struggled with equipment, some have struggled with raw material and supply chain, but in general, the management of the factories is a big challenge. Getting the right people in the right place to organize those factories is proving a big challenge. It's bound to be that way when you see such a quick increase in the processing capacity. So existing processors are struggling to manage their businesses, and the projects, the new processing units coming on stream, they're struggling with implementation of the projects. And that ranges from simply getting delivery of the machines that they've bought, to building a supply chain, to controlling quality, to meeting buyers' expectations, and particularly to marketing. Marketing, despite money spent by development organizations, marketing of cashew kernels, generally across West Africa, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, remains a significant weakness. How to do it, who to talk to, still has not been conquered by many of the processors in the country. Maybe not surprising, given that they're struggling with all the other areas of management of a cashew factory, but nonetheless, it is having a significant impact and is partly to blame for the fact that most of the cashew kernels, or part processed kernels, end up being reprocessed in Vietnam. That's Cote d'Ivoire, that was West Africa. Let's see how that all comes together in terms of world production forecasts for 2022. Generally speaking, again, the high-end forecast and the low-end forecast based on different sources. We think that the crop will be bigger than last year. That's mainly driven by a better crop in India and a better crop in Cambodia, partly offset by the situation in Vietnam and by lower crops probably in Nigeria, and quite possibly in Ghana too. We're not looking at any oversupply situation. As far as I can gather right now, we're not looking at any undersupply situation. Production is in or around where it was. Now we're going to come back to that because we need to put that into the context of the current price of cashew kernels and raw cashew nuts. Based on relatively modest increase in prices, the question is, why are kernels prices at 10-year lows? But before we do that, we'd have a look at consumption. And again, when we look at consumption, we're seeing, generally speaking, pretty good news around the world. Starting with the world's biggest consumer, India, we certainly see the impact of the pandemic in the estimates of consumption over the last 2 years. Last year, consumption did recover from 2020, but if we look at growth rates and we take a 10-year view, you've got to look at these things in a long-term perspective. So we take a 10-year perspective, and annual growth up to 2019 was around 7% per annum. If you do the same calculation by 2021, it's about 4%. So the chances are we'll see a return to this figure of 7%, and thus we're talking about an increase in consumption. Elsewhere, we see very positive trends in the European Union. 2021, a 3.8% increase. Doesn't sound like a lot in the context of a 10-year average of 6.8%, but if we look back and see the 2020 increase, particularly the 2019 increase, we're seeing a surge in demand for cashew kernels in Europe. The United States, well, it really was the star market last year, 9.5% increase in imports. And you need to put that in context too. So let's look back. The US is the gray bars. So if we look back 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, very little growth in the US market. Now we're beginning to see a surge. Now, is it just pandemic related? I don't think so. I think it's highly related to price, but it's also related to all those trends that similarly have influenced European consumption. So what we're seeing is a 5.3% 10-year average growth rate, and that's been exceeded in 2021. Question for 2022 is that a signal of things to come, or is it a function of perhaps building bigger inventories, perhaps managing the difficult freight situation? My guess is we will see increased demand in the United States. So in general, on consumption, we're seeing big consumer trends continuing to have an impact on the market. We're seeing low prices, and we're seeing India having been hit by COVID-19. The lifting of those restrictions should mean a return to growth. Overall, we're expecting in 2022 that consumption will tend back toward the average. So that means it will be positive in most markets. We should make a little look at China. China is not yet a gigantic market, but it is a big market. It's 85,000 tons import from Vietnam, according to the Vietnamese figures last year, 7.5% growth and strong 10-year growth. So if we look at the markets in general, and we see approaching 7% in Europe over 10 years, around 5% in the US, probably returning to around 7% in India, and about 6% in China, we're seeing a very positive growth in the consumption of cashews worldwide. Now, what does that mean for the different regions, and what does it mean specifically for African cashew processors? Well, we took two markets, and you could take the European Union, 2021, about 11%, 10.8, I think it was, percent share for African cashew processors. Still, Vietnam has the lion's share, around 77%. India's share has been falling and is likely to continue to fall. And Brazil it's a relatively steady share, and it tends to fall in Europe and go up in the US and then maybe reverse that the following year, depending on the crop. If we look at the US market, we see that African processors still stuck around 5% market share, and Vietnam has this enormous share of the US market, around 89%. Bear in mind, most of that 89% is cashews that were grown in African countries. So the big headlines for 2021 were that African cashews returned to a double-digit, 11%, share of the EU market for the first time since the 1970s. That is progress, albeit slow progress. African 320s, particularly West African, are about 40 cents per pound higher than Vietnamese similar product in today's market. And it's been that way since last April. And if we look at the trends in consumption imports in the two Northern Hemisphere consumers, and we take all Africa, so that's all African countries together, we see a steady, slightly volatile trend in the US, and we see a very strong growth in imports in the European Union, particularly since 2017. Of course, that's a really positive factor. The increase in imports, mainly driven by increases from Cote d'Ivoire, but there are also increases from Nigeria. But unfortunately, exports to Europe from Benin, Mali, Guinea-Bissau of kernels have really gone nowhere. Some encouraging news from Burkina Faso, where shipments have increased during 2021 and have been on a pretty steady increase, but from a relatively modest base. The US, I think that the lack of improvement in trade on kernels, the US, is related to price. It may also be related to the adjustment needed to meet the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is complex. And whereas in Europe, at the moment, once you get a BRC or a HACCP, you probably open that market. I think it's also important to recognize that the fact that the CFA, the currency in West Africa, is linked to the euro, can have a really positive effect on trade with the European Union and sales of cashew kernels. So positive, but relatively slow moving situation in terms of Africa's share. But this could turn out to be a highly significant year when we return to this double-digit consumption. And often what you see in these situations is it reaches a certain level, confidence grows, and then it moves on very quickly to the next level. Let's have a look at prices, and you can see the roller coaster, as I call it, of cashew prices. As we're doing a preview, I went back, put a chart together for 20 years. You can see huge volatility, 2008, 2010, 2017, major volatility, high prices. Each high is higher, 1, 2, 3, 4 highs, and then each time there's a crash. And each time the lower level was lower until we got to recent events. Now, the impact of the pandemic on that remains to be seen. So if we look at prices today in the general market, and here I'm talking about the Vietnamese as the lowest priced origin in the market at the moment, we're looking now at the lowest prices since May 2010. So if we exclude those two dips, so there was a dip in February 2020, and there was another one about a year later, around March, April 2021, when the market hit some of its lower positions. In both cases, it bounced off those dips pretty quickly. So you would have to ask yourself, are we looking at a tactic, a a way to perhaps influence the market. If we look at the offers in the market today at the very low prices, we're looking at essentially positions that most buyers don't need, March and April shipments. We're looking at very light volume offered. And when there's no buyers in the market, if you offer into it, well, it's only going to go one way, and that is down. If we look at prices in Africa, we see qualified, and I stress qualified African suppliers. That qualified means that you have the right food safety, you have capacity, you're in a position to market, and you have some contacts that you can talk to. Qualified suppliers are making prices in or around about $3.20, in some cases a little bit more than that. Overall, cashew kernel prices today are really good value. Prices we haven't seen for 10 years, although we have seen dips to those prices in each of the last 3 years. But in each time that it's hit those levels, it's bounced off them and moved back up. So the market remains in a kind of a holding pattern in terms of price, though it's probably at the lower end. And whether or not these low prices are sustainable, looking at it, they're not sustainable in terms of the trends in demand. They're not sustainable in terms of the value and the production costs of raw cashew nuts. So you would expect the market maybe to do something similar to last year. And at some point, it will break out of this pattern and we will see a more normal return. Steady prices, consistent prices are really good for demand. If we go back and look at 2012, the 3 years that followed, these were some of the periods of the highest growth in demand and consumption of cashews in history. Return to steady prices, not at these levels because they're not sustainable, but at more sustainable levels could be very far reaching, could have a really positive impact. So we should expect buyers to come to market to buy probably as much as they can, as far forward as they can on kernels within the constraints that are placed on them by the financial circumstances and the economic circumstances. And as we know, the last 2 years have been quite uncertain, and 2022, for different reasons, again, looks to have some uncertainty. So looking at logistics and freight, and we see that not much has changed. There are still very high freight rates from Asia. There are still disruptions to shipments, slow shipments, congestion, and reduced capacity. African processors still have a 16 to 20 cents per pound freight advantage over their competitors in Asia. They still have shorter sailing times to markets in North America and in Europe, and possibly to the Middle East too. And this, we think, is likely to continue throughout 2020. There's unlikely to be a drop in freight prices. The invasion by Russia of Ukraine has boosted oil prices to levels that we haven't seen for a long time. It's increased the strength of the dollar. So all factors are pointing toward high freight rates again this year and continued disruption. That means that there will be problems on the shipment of raw cashew nuts. There will be higher costs, and it also means that African processors are likely to keep their advantage in terms of freight. So we're stepping back a little bit from the nitty-gritty of the market. We have a look at some of the big pictures. And the question is really, we identified last year some of the big winners in 2021, qualified African processors, retailers, RCN traders, organic producers, and processors. And it does look as if the trends in 2022 are likely to lead to the same winners. Maybe, just maybe we could add in farmers on prices, but probably not farmers on crop size and yield, which is likely to be unchanged. But it looks in many ways similar to last year in terms of where's the best place to be, what's the best type of stakeholder to be in this market. We look at the outlook. So again, as you know, if you attend these things, I like to look back and then look forward. So I thought I'd look at what we thought about in December and what we suggested in December would happen. So we said India and Vietnam will continue to support RCN prices, which has pretty much been the case, that the buyers of kernels would stay away from the market, which they did, that the freight disruption would continue, which it has, that there would be some disruption to the crops, and it looks like, unfortunately, that is the case. Certainly in Vietnam and Cambodia, and less likely but possible in West Africa too. That does not mean there's any kind of a supply shortage emerging. There is not. The short-term supply, which means 2022, is sufficient. We said at that time that the Tanzanian crop wouldn't reach the forecast levels, and unfortunately it didn't. And we predicted more regulation in 2022. How has that changed? What's the outlook that we're seeing at this moment in time? So we would still say that Indian buyers are likely to support RCN prices. We think that the Vietnamese buyers have a little bit more time, but then again, they have a lot greater need in terms of the volumes they will want to buy. Vietnam would like to maintain its export volume of cashew kernels in 2022. I think the value will increase because prices will increase. Volume is another question, but there will be still a really major import need for Vietnam. At what moment does that come to the market is the question. I suspect we'll see kernels buyers back in the market during this month. They will have pretty decent cover through the first half of the year, but given long voyage times, and now that we get a better picture on the new crop, we would expect to see them back in the market. Freight disruption will continue. We're suggesting that the crops in West Africa need to be closely followed, because normally when you get some kind of weather disruption, that story tends to develop. It can quickly be reversed, but most times it tends to slip and get worse. So it needs to be looked at closely, and particularly India, the timing of the crop in India and whether or not a later crop will damage the volumes available. No sign of a shortage of cashews to my mind, but I strongly think that the current kernels prices, and here we're talking about the benchmark 320s below $2.90 FOB, this is simply not sustainable. And finally, we're looking at a stronger US dollar this year, again, stimulated by the attack on Ukraine, and that will have an impact on the cashew market. So in general, a positive outlook. We hoping that the crops are not on the lower end of our estimates. We're hoping they're on the higher end. Even if they are, we think that kernels prices will steady up during this year. That doesn't mean that raw cashew nut prices will get stronger. If you look at kernels today and you look at raw cashew nut prices, there simply is no calculation for the processor. And until there is, there's going to be a limit on where raw cashew nut prices can go. So I feel that we should look to kernels to lead the next move in the market. Probably our raw cashew nut prices steady, but kernel prices moving up over the next, and it may not be a sudden movement. It may take a couple of months to happen, but I think it will happen over those couple of months. That's 2022. Let's have a look a little bit further forward. This is a little bit guesswork, but nonetheless. So we're still expecting that there will be a rationalization in Vietnam, that there will be fewer factories 3-4 years from now in Vietnam, that they will be better in terms of their food safety and their practices, but perhaps that the volume processed will be no greater. We think one of the factors in this will be that roasters will start to buy more directly. Retailers too, I think. There will be, to my mind, and this was confirmed by what I saw last week, that There will be a number of factories in West Africa that won't make it, a number of projects that won't come to fruition, but that there will be some very successful factories and that they will eventually take over some of the less successful factories. And that will be a kind of a rationalization. I think we're going to see that around 2025. We'll continue to see Cambodia on the rise in terms of its production. Whether or not that means value addition remains to be seen. And I think we're going to see a recovery in Tanzanian processing. We're seeing some projects evolving, some construction ongoing, and this is long needed, and it's related to the changes in the regulatory environment and the access that processors now have directly to primary cooperatives and to farmers. Overall, we will see greater cost efficiency in processing in Africa. We are already seeing this. We are already seeing certain factories, when we take into account their processing costs and adjust that for the costs of moving the raw material all the way to Vietnam, for processing, they are already competitive. So I think we will see the well-managed factories in West Africa build, grow, and be sustained. I think it's important also to remember, just on this general topic of sustainability, that over the last few years, it's very clearly emerged that cashew kernels, cashew nuts generally, are the most sustainable of the tree nuts, comparing them to walnuts or almonds or others. And that within that segment, within the sustainable tree nut that cashew nuts is, African cashew nuts are the most sustainable. African cashew nuts, when they're processed in Africa, are the most sustainable tree nuts in the world. So thanks very much for your attention. It's great to be back with you again. It signals the start of another season. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to try and explain some of the points I've been making. Ernest, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. As always, giving it to us with all the clarity that it needs. And we are very thankful and grateful for the information and the update you have given. As Jim said, if there is any need for clarification, further clarification or any questions, you can write them in the Q&A section, and then we will address Jim with it. But Jim, it does appear that the key highlights are the growing production in Cambodia, and then we also see growth in processing in Africa, even though it's a 0.7%, 10.7% increase. It is still significant enough considering the fact that it's been around 10% over the years. But then what is a bit worrying is the mixed forecast in Africa. We see strong growth in Cote d'Ivoire anyway, but then overall stagnating growth in the other countries. And I don't know whether in your estimations, if you are looking also a bit into the future, let's say for the next 5 years, if it should go this way, what will be the impact on general production money, and then also on even RCN prices. So Jim, if you could take that one.
Sorry, Ernest, I didn't quite get that question.
Yeah, so so I'm saying that if you look at the major highlights, growing production, processing in Africa, also growth in production in Cambodia, and overall growth in production in particularly West Africa. But then here it is on account of the growth in Cote d'Ivoire. So the question is whether with the stagnating growth in the other countries, we are likely to arrive in a situation where production overall is going to slump, and what impact it's going to have, particularly on prices of RCN in the coming years.
Yeah, sorry, I understand the question now. I think that it is of some concern that there hasn't been greater growth in production across the region. I think, first of all, we have to remember that Nigeria has seen good growth in recent years. It's just this year that it hasn't been as good. We also should remember that, take a country like Nigeria, where a lot of the cashews grow wild and the trees aren't looked after, you're bound to see years where there will be a big weather impact. Elsewhere, we know that there are ambitions and projects in countries like Benin, Guinea-Bissau, to improve production. We know that in Ghana, the sector is now being regulated for the first time. We know that in Ghana, there are opportunities for the increase in production. So when we comment on stagnating production, we comment on the current situation. If consumption were to continue to rise on the current trend, and if production were to maintain its current trajectory, we would run into a situation where generally cashew nut prices would increase. There would eventually be a shortage because, as we know, cashew nut trees need to be renewed. So looking around West Africa, which has been the driver of the increases in production, imagine a situation where Cambodia hadn't entered the market with large volumes in the last 3 years. We would be in a very, very tight supply situation. Now, I know that's ridiculous in the sense that it's a fact that Cambodia is there. But what I'm saying is that the future's unclear. We need to realize that we can't take for granted that production in West Africa, which has been the driver of world production for many years, will continue. And production needs to be stimulated. Now, it won't be stimulated by low prices, and it won't be stimulated by difficulties in accessing seedlings, difficulties in accessing assistance as a farmer, and it definitely won't be assisted by the impact of climate change. And if, for example, we look at the UN report from last week, we can see that, yes, on the one hand, the areas suitable for growing cashew nuts will increase, but they may well be different areas. So this might need a major adjustment. So I don't think that we should be considering that we can take this increase in production for granted. The trend is definitely slowing, and that needs to be looked at. There's always a risk with cashews that in a very tight supply situation, prices will get so high that the product will start to be forced out of the market. So we need to take that into account. And some governments are, and others aren't.
Thank you very much, Jim. The other issue has to do with the Broma kernels. And then you are talking about the fact that about 62% of the partially processed kernels in Cote d'Ivoire are heading for Vietnam. And that, in your view, it is not a positive sign. But what exactly makes it not so positive in your view, beyond the fact that they are leaving shells in Africa?
Well, I mean, if you look at the situation on Burma kernels, first of all, what are they? So this is a part process where you've shelled the nut, but left the skin, the testa on, and you're shipping it out. First of all, let's look at this simply from a value-added perspective. Does this maximize the value addition? No, not at all. Is it beneficial to African processors? Not really. It's an opportunistic type trade. It's an opportunistic type trade designed to get around originally designed to get around certain restrictions on import, but later continued as a part process. It's a way to boost up your processing volume. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's subsidized by the government, not to the same extent as full processing. I think the rate is about half. But here you have a trade that is subsidized by the government, that has no real level of value addition, in the sense that the transformation from a Burma kernel to a fully fledged cashew kernel as an ingredient is where most of the value is added. It limits the opportunity for further value addition. It limits the opportunity to develop consumer packs. It limits the opportunity to create domestic consumption. it's not even beneficial in general terms to many of the processors in Vietnam, who themselves would prefer to buy the raw cashew nuts and do the entire process. So I think this is an opportunistic trade that's detrimental to the overall development of the sector, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire. It gives a kind of a halfway house of processing, which is not necessary because we can see that there are successful factories doing a good job. There are certified factories. There are exports, as we've seen, to Europe and to the United States, very demanding markets. Why do we need Burma kernels? And in my view, we don't. I think it will eventually die out, but I would like to see something done about it because it's not really constructive in the overall perspective of the development of African cashews. And a buyer observing this trade is bound to ask, why is it happening? What's wrong with African processing that makes this kind of trade necessary? And I think we should bear that in mind too. Ernest.
Hello, Jim.
Yeah.
Hello, Jim. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes. I thought I'd left you
Yes.
speechless with that answer.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. All right. Actually, you've touched a bit on the conflict in the north of the Black Sea and any impact on the markets yet. But then the point is that are there any foreseeable impact in the future? What would that be in terms of, would it be on the consumption of kernels, or what exactly would this be in your view? Even though currently there is no impact on the market, what can be the foreseeable impact? Or we say like COVID, nothing, we move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's shocking what we're seeing in Ukraine. I do business there and I'm almost speechless by the things I see. I think we have to recognize that, first of all, that's a horrific human tragedy. If we look at the situation in our market, let's say in a very cold manner, first of all, what we're going to see is we see a stronger dollar. That's got an influence. It's possible that the war would be followed by some form of recession, which could have an impact on consumption. I think in direct terms, we see higher oil prices, which will influence freight and distribution costs. It's unlikely to be a huge impact on consumption in the short term. Neither Ukraine nor Russia are major consumers of cashew nuts, although both could be sometime in the future. If, of course, that war were to spread elsewhere in Europe, then that's a completely different situation. But so what I'm saying is, based on the expectations that the war will be limited to Ukraine, as horrific as that is, that we will not see impacts other than higher costs and a stronger US dollar. Ernest.
Hello, thank you very much, Jim. I think at this point there are no further questions on the platforms. So we will thank you very much for the excellent presentation, and then to ask from you what will be expected in the next fortnight when you come our way again with the Global Markets Encounter.
There are a few questions in the chat, Ernest. I don't know if you want to have a look at some of those.
Yeah, we have looked at it. It's talking more about finding out about the challenges in processing and the fact that African countries have not been still able to reach to a large extent the objectives in processing the local production. And I think these are issues that you have also by and large talking about. But I think if you still want to even address it, in Guinea-Bissau today, we can tell a declining trend in production. And you have mentioned the issues of aging trees poor spacing, poor harvesting methods, and the rest. But in your view, do you pick something else beyond the issues that you've already talked about, as explaining the challenges that have been faced today in Guinea-Bissau on the front of processing as well as mainly production?
I think the production issue in Guinea-Bissau, it's fairly clear what needs to be done. It needs a lot of rehabilitation of production. The trees, and here you're faced with this major problem that, for example, the trees are tending to be very close together. This is reducing the overall yield, though the quality we know is really good. And so we get a situation where you have, if you fix what's needed to be fixed, then for 2 to 3 years, the income of that farm family is reduced. And some kind of a bridge is necessary to help them maintain their incomes. And people do rely on cashews in Guinea-Bissau. A bridge needs to be built, financial bridge that is, to sustain them whilst their trees are rehabilitated. There's no reason to think that if that were done, that production should not grow. In terms of processing in Guinea-Bissau, I think the main problem over the years has been the instability in the country and the lack of attractiveness of investment there in terms simply of risk. So if we look at what's made Cote d'Ivoire successful in processing, we're looking at widespread supports for processing, a very large crop, improvements in the quality of that crop. Even without direct subsidies, it's quite likely that processing in the country would have increased, though the subsidies have played an enormous role in that. I think that if we look at Guinea-Bissau in many ways, given the high yielding nature of the nuts, given the location, there's every opportunity to develop processing there. But it's going to be a long, long journey, given the necessary changes to the infrastructure and development, and certainly the necessary reputational changes to stimulate investment and even to stimulate buying. You know, one of the things about successful processing countries is they are places where people feel safe in investing, and they are places where people feel safe visiting and doing business. Any difficulties in either of those areas means it's going to be very difficult to develop processing, even if the production problems are addressed. I think the other thing about the rehabilitation of the crop and the trees in Guinea-Bissau is that the variety selection is really important, so that in order to stimulate processing, you have a nut that's suitable for modern processing by machines. And that means that nuts that are a bit more like what might be growing in Benin or in Ghana or in Tanzania for that matter, or in Senegal, then, you know, the smaller high yielding nuts. And whether that's post-harvest or variety needs to be identified too. It's a big subject, Ernest, the difficulties in Guinea-Bissau, and maybe one day we should do a whole discussion on that one.
Yeah, precisely. But you seem to believe that Tanzania is currently on the right path in terms of attracting investment and also increasing processing locally in the country. What is this based on? Yes.
Well, we are definitely seeing an increase in processing. We are seeing projects to build good-sized processing plants currently in action. Now, we know for many years that the country has had excellent quality raw cashew nuts with good processing characteristics and a large size. We're now seeing a couple of things have happened. One, regulation. So regulation now is much more encouraging for processors. So you can now, with the right permissions, you can buy your cashew nuts as a processor legally and directly from local primary cooperative unions or other farmer groups. That means that you've access to a supply chain and you don't have to compete directly in the auction, which was an area of complexity and an area of price inflation for processors. Processors want to know they can get their raw material regularly from the same people and have a relationship with those suppliers. At least successful processors want that. That's beginning in Tanzania. Secondly, we're seeing production, although we have to remark, it's been disappointing in the last 2 years where we expected much higher production. But we are definitely seeing production moving in the right direction. We're seeing that as the result of many years of really good research on varieties. And we're seeing production spread much more widely throughout the country. All of these things add to the opportunity for processing. So you have a good raw material, you have access to the supply chain, you have opportunity to invest, and you have a good location. Plus, although it's been a good and a difficult factor in the past, you have a crop in the opposite season to most cashew crops, October through to January. And that has been a disadvantage because you've got to cope with RCN buying from India, particularly in the past during that window, but could also be an advantage in that there will be fresh new crop cashew kernels available. And if production spreads across the country, you could even get a situation where you have new cashews available all the way through from end September through to the end of April, if you get a north and a southern crop in the country. So those are the key things. And I think changes in regulation over the past 18 months has been key in encouraging processing development. And I hope that will continue from here.
Thank you very much, Jim. And finally, if you could tell us what to expect in the next fortnight.
I would say in the next fortnight, I think probably relatively stable raw cashew nut prices. Maybe a little bit of movement, but I don't really see prices coming down. I do not see raw RCN prices coming down to match kernels prices. And therefore, I do expect kernels prices to steady up a little bit, but I'm not sure that will happen in the next 2 weeks. I think that it could happen over the next month or so. So I think probably a relatively stable couple of weeks, steady RCN prices, kernels prices beginning maybe to perk up a little bit, but I'm not expecting any huge activity. I think we will see a stronger dollar in the next 2 weeks, and that will have its own impact. We probably won't see a resolution of the situation in Ukraine, and therefore 2 weeks from now, we'll still be looking at a great deal of uncertainty.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. It's been a pleasure being with you today, and also our thanks goes to the participants and our sponsors. And at this stage, I hand over to my co-moderator, Blessing, to take you through the rest of the program.
Thank you, Ernest. Hello, Ernest, I can hear you. Thank you, Ernest, Jim, and to everyone who joined us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, as we recommence the ACA Global Market Encounter 2022 edition. As mentioned by Ernest, the next edition or session will be held on the 16th of March, and we want to acknowledge our sponsors and partners who continually make it possible for us to bring your way the ACA Global Market Encounter. We would also like to inform you that the next ACA Annual Cashew Conference, which is the 16th edition, will be held in Abuja, Nigeria. The date is 12th to the 16th of September, 2022. Mark your calendars. Come sponsor, partner, or exhibit. Whichever way, be a part of the largest cashew event in Africa. And it's going to happen 12th to the 16th of September in Abuja, Nigeria. For more information on how to partner, sponsor, or exhibit at the ACA Annual Cashew Conference, you may contact us at aca@africancashewalliance.com. I repeat, aca@africancashewalliance.com. We look forward to hosting you again physically, and of course, see you next 2 Wednesdays on the 16th of March for the next session of the Global Market Encounter. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.
What do you care most when buying color sorters? What makes better sorting performance? What ensures high stability and reliability regardless of 1 unit or 10,000 units? Quality is all.